My name is Detective Marcus Thorne. I've been with the Olympus City Police Department for 18 years, a career defined by the grim, the mundane, and the occasional blast of pure, sickening evil. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the file that landed on my desk in the dead heart of winter, a file that was barely a file at all. Just an oversized, coffee-stained manila folder labeled in a shaky hand, Sector 8, Unauthorized Closure. Sector 8 was a newly developed industrial zone on the city's outskirts, mostly warehouses and logistics hubs. A place so forgettable it barely registered on the crime maps. Which is why the sudden, total closure of the entire zone, no explanation given, just concrete barriers and state patrol cars, was a massive red flag. The official line was a severe environmental hazard containment. The unofficial line, whispered by the patrolman who'd been rotated off the blockade, was far more disturbing. It's the quiet, detective, Officer Jenkins had told me, his eyes wide and hollow, tracing a pattern on my worn wooden desk. The kind of quiet that swallows sound. You could stand a foot from your partner, and their voice, it felt like it was coming from a mile away, thin and brittle. My superior, Captain Davies, a man whose face was carved from 20 years of nicotine and cynicism, had been evasive. It's a cleanup operation, Thorne. High-level chemicals. Forget about it. But Davies avoided my gaze, and I'd seen him sweat during a routine internal audit. The man was terrified. The hook, the single detail that pulled me into the abyss, was an unofficial supplementary report filed by a patrol unit 2 nights before the zone was sealed. A welfare check call from the single, lone security guard stationed at the massive, automated Logos Transit Hub, the biggest facility in Sector 8. The guard's name was Lenny Kresnik. He was a veteran, dull as dirt, clock-punching kind of guy. Not prone to panic, his initial log entry, 2340 hours, checked perimeters. All secure. Routine, his final entry, 115 hours, transcribed from a frantic, broken audio recording recovered from his discarded body cam sad face sound of high-frequency static and labored breathing. I see it. I see the light, it's not right. Too close to the perimeter fence. Looks like a flare, but it's not going up. It's just, there. Hanging. A choked gasp, I'm heading out to investigate. Protocol states, the sound of a heavy metal door slamming shut, followed by footsteps on gravel. God, the air is cold. Colder than it should be. The light, it's not a flare. It's a doorway? No, that's crazy, Lenny, pull yourself together. It's a trick of the light. Reflective paint on the fence. His voice drops to a horrified whisper, it's pulsing. Like a heart. And the color, it's not yellow, not red. It's that blue. The color of a bruise after the life's gone out of it, a long pause, filled only with the relentless static and a low, resonant thrumming sound that vibrated through the mic. The ground. The asphalt around it, it's dissolving. Not melting. It's just, gone. Like chalk in water. And there's a shape. Something coming through. It's tall. Too tall. And the sound it's making, it's not a language. It's like 1,000 tiny needles scraping on glass, right inside my skull. A sudden, ear-shattering shriek, not Lenny's, but something utterly inhuman, followed by the sound of the body cam hitting the ground and rolling. The last 30 seconds of the recording were nothing but the rhythmic thrumming, the relentless static, and the faint, wet sound of something being dragged across the gravel. Lenny Kresnik was never found. Only the body cam and his standard-issue security flashlight, lying 20 feet from a perfectly circular section of melted, strangely vitrified asphalt, a circle 10 feet in diameter right up against the Sector 8 perimeter fence. A circle that seemed to absorb the light, rather than reflect it, the official report. Missing person. Presumed. Exposure to hazardous materials that I knew better. I looked at the manila folder, at the grainy photograph of Lenny Kresnik's terrified, ordinary face, and I heard that sound again, the high-pitched, resonant thrumming. I knew that the real terror wasn't in the chemical spill, the terror was in the anomaly. And it had left an empty space in the world that something else had clearly filled. That I drove out to the perimeter barrier that night, the city lights fading behind me. The silence that hit me as I approached Sector 8 was oppressive, heavy, and cold. I killed the engine, and the absence of sound was immediate and absolute. It felt less like a quiet place, and more like a void where sound died. That I rolled down the window. The air that seeped in smelled of ozone, burnt copper, and something sickeningly metallic, like old, spoiled blood. I looked over the concrete barrier, into the pitch-black heart of Sector 8. And that's when I saw the light, faint, distant, and exactly where Lenny Kresnik had described it. That deep, bruise-colored, Venus blue, and it was pulsing. Slowly. Inhaling the light of the city. Exhaling the absolute blackness of something truly alien. That I pulled out my phone, a police burner, and took a single, grainy photograph of the pulsing blue glow. I didn't send it to anyone. I just saved it, because I knew, in the chilling core of my gut, that this wasn't a crime scene anymore. This was a doorway. And the Sector 8 closure wasn't to keep people out, it was to keep something in. Or maybe, to keep what was coming from getting out. My 18 years of service were about to take a hard, unrecoverable turn into the impossible. The Bruise-Blue light pulsed again, a slow, deep breath taken by the hidden anomaly within Sector 8. I sat in my unmarked Crown Victoria, the engine off, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy weight of an unnatural silence. My hand instinctively rested on the butt of my sidearm. 18 years on the force taught me that fear is a luxury, but the prickle running down my spine wasn't about a perp with a knife, it was something primal, something my cop training had no file on. That I couldn't just stand at the barrier. Captain Davies' fear was infectious, and it smelled less like bureaucratic caution and more like a massive, high-level cover-up. They hadn't closed Sector 8 to clean a spill. They'd closed it to quarantine a truth. That I pulled out the satellite map of the area, a standard logistics grid provided by the city planning office. The perimeter was massive, secured by the new, high-tech, smart fence, a 12-foot chain link topped with razor wire and equipped with motion sensors every 50 yards, all linked back to a central, heavily fortified security shed, except for one point, southwest corner. Right where the old abandoned freight rail spur jutted into the zone. The map showed a small, ancient drainage culvert passing beneath the fence line. Too small for a car, but maybe. I drove my unmarked car 5 miles out of the way, circling through the tangled backroads of the decommissioned power plant, until I reached the muddy embankment overlooking the rail spur. The air here was marginally better, the silence less absolute. Parking the car deep in a patch of scrub brush, I grabbed my gear, flashlight, sidearm, an extra magazine, and a heavy-duty bolt cutter, not standard issue, but absolutely necessary. I wore dark, non-reflective tactical gear, trading my detective's coat for practicality. The rail spur was overgrown, the rusted track sinking into the earth. I followed the line until the chain-link barrier rose up before me, a stark, metallic scar against the night. The thrumming sound from Lenny Kresnik's recording was barely audible here, a low, tectonic hum felt more in the chest than heard in the ear. I found the culvert. It was barely 2 feet high, choked with stagnant water, old leaves, and a sickly, pale mold. A quick sweep with the flashlight confirmed it. The fence ran over it, the gap below secured only by a loose sheet of heavily rusted corrugated steel. Someone, perhaps Lenny during a routine check, had jury-rigged a cover that I dropped to my belly, the cold, muddy water immediately soaking my clothes. The smell was intense, mildew, iron, and that alien metallic tang. I used my flashlight to nudge the rusted steel sheet. It groaned, a hideous sound in the oppressive silence, and slid away, revealing the dark, narrow tunnel that I squeezed through, dragging my gear behind me. The movement scraped painfully against the concrete, the sound echoing briefly before being abruptly swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the zone. When I emerged on the Sector 8 side, I stood up, taking a deep, ragged breath. I was inside. The first thing I noticed was the light pollution. Or rather, the lack of it. The towering streetlights and floodlights meant to illuminate the massive logistics yards were all dark. Power outage? Or deliberately shut down. The second thing was the temperature. It was drastically, unnaturally colder than the world outside the fence. The air felt heavy, like breathing liquid nitrogen. My breath plumed out in thick, white clouds that I checked my phone. No signal. Just a blank, white screen. Isolated that I kept to the shadows of the massive, looming warehouses. The logo's transit hub, Lenny's posting, was 2 miles due north. And the Bruise-Blue light? It pulsed faintly from the eastern sector, not logos. It was coming from the area labeled on the map as the Atlas Research and Distribution Facility. A high-security, low-profile facility that specialized in biotech and exotic materials. A quick detour to Atlas was necessary. I needed to see what Kresnik SAW.as. I moved past the first massive warehouse bay. I heard something. Not the high-pitched shriek from the recording, but a low, clicking sound. Like 2 stones being rhythmically tapped together. Click. Click. Click that I froze, pressing myself into the oily shadow of a loading dock. I deactivated my flashlight. My heart hammered against my ribs, a loud, vulgar sound in the silence. The clicking was moving. Slow. Deliberate. And it was getting closer that I peered around the corner of the loading bay. The warehouse district was a nightmare of shadows and industrial geometry. Then, I saw it. A figure that it was impossibly tall, maybe 7 feet, silhouetted against the ambient light from the distant city, which seemed only to highlight its impossible structure. It wasn't walking. It was moving with an unnatural, gliding smoothness, its joints clicking with that horrible rhythm, and its head, it wasn't a head. It was a smooth, elongated vertical shape, utterly featureless, yet it felt like it was observing me. As it passed beneath a weak, flickering emergency light, I saw the color of its body. It wasn't the uniform black of a shadow. It was that same deep, bruised, Venus blue. The color of the pulsing light. The color of death. It stopped, the clicking ceased. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My training told me to challenge, to draw my weapon. But everything in my mind screamed, do not be seen. The tall, blue figure slowly, sickeningly, turned its featureless head toward my hiding spot. I heard a sound then, not a click, not a scrape, but a dry, resonant hiss that felt like it was directly inside my ear canal. Then, slowly, deliberately, it began to glide in my direction. The hunt had begun. The glide of the blue figure was silent on the asphalt, defying the laws of friction, yet its approach was punctuated by that dry, resonant hiss, a sound that seemed to dismantle my very sense of reality. Every nerve ending screamed for me to run, but my training, 18 years of suppressing panic, locked my feet in place. I held my breath, the metallic odor burning in my nostrils. It stopped about 10 feet away from the loading dock where I was concealed. The silence returned, magnified by the figure's sheer, unsettling presence. It stood there, a vertical smear of bruised blue in the gloom, its featureless head tilted slightly. It wasn't looking at me with eyes, it was observing me with an impossible, all-encompassing sense of awareness. Then, the clicking returned, but this time, it sounded different, faster, agitated. And the silence was broken by a new sound, a sound that made my blood turn to ice, the faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of another creature moving in the distance, responding to the first that I had to move. Now that I used the briefest window of opportunity, the moment the first figure shifted its weight slightly, to execute a rolling dive under the parked semi-trailer beside the dock. The ground was cold, oily, and offered minimal cover, but it was cover nonetheless. The first blue figure reacted instantly. The hiss escalated into a sharp, tearing sound. I heard a heavy thud against the semi's tires, followed by a sickening metallic screech as something impossibly strong scraped along the axle that I didn't stop to look. I scrambled out the other side, darting across a wide expanse of open concrete towards the nearest stack of empty shipping crates. I glanced back just as I reached the crates. The creature was no longer gliding. It was pursuing me with a series of jerky, hyper-efficient leaps, its long, spindly limbs snapping out. As it moved under a mercury vapor lamp, I caught a terrifying glimpse of its skin. It wasn't skin at all. It was an intricate lattice of fine, pulsing blue filaments, seemingly holding a hollow structure together. I tucked myself between two enormous refrigerated containers, forcing myself to slow my breathing. The thump-thump-thump of the second creature was much closer now. They were hurting me. My destination, the Atlas Research and Distribution Facility, was now less than 100 yards away. I realized the creatures weren't moving aimlessly, they were patrolling a perimeter. The anomaly was likely within Atlas. I drew my flashlight, shielding the lens with my hand to allow only a sliver of light, and checked my weapon. I was a detective, not SWAT, but in this situation, hollow points felt miserably inadequate. I sprinted the last 50 yards, using the massive containers as temporary shields, the rhythmic clicking and thumping of my pursuers gaining rapidly. The Atlas facility was a single, squat, windowless concrete structure, ringed by a high electrical fence, the only facility in Sector 8 with a second layer of security. The main gate was secured by a heavy keycard lock, inert in the power outage, but there was a service door on the western face. I reached the door, panting, adrenaline masking the cold. It was a thick steel door, locked with a heavy manual deadbolt. I pulled the bolt cutters from my gear bag. No time for subtlety. The metal groaned under the pressure of the cutters. The first snip of the hardened steel bolt sounded like a cannon shot in the void. Hiosssss. The sound of the blue creatures was right behind me. They knew where I was. I cut the second bolt. The door shuddered. I slammed my shoulder into it once, twice, and the heavy steel burst inward with a deafening crash. I dove inside, rolling to my feet, and immediately swung the heavy steel door shut. Using a thick industrial cable I tore from the wall to jury-rig a temporary lock. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it bought me seconds. I was in a dark, concrete utility corridor. The air inside was warm, almost humid, a stark contrast to the cryogenic cold outside. The only light source was a series of weak, red emergency lights mounted low on the walls. The corridor led to a central atrium. As I stepped out, I stopped dead. This wasn't a logistics facility. It was a bunker. The atrium was vast, 3 stories high, and lined with thick, reinforced concrete. Equipment racks, cables, and sealed ventilation shafts covered the walls. The air here vibrated with the continuous, low-frequency thrumming I'd heard on Lenny's recording, but here, it was physically painful, vibrating in my teeth. In the center of the atrium, suspended over a wide, circular pit, was the source of the Bruise-Blue light. It wasn't a flare. It wasn't a machine. It was a swirling, three-dimensional geometric shape, a hypercube, perhaps, but it defied stable geometry. It was rotating slowly, silently, radiating the cold, Venus blue light. This was the anomaly. The doorway, and below it, inside the deep circular pit, illuminated by the blue light, was a containment field. Or what was left of one. The pit was a mess of sparking, broken machinery and fused metal. But the most horrifying detail was the human figures. Several of them. All wearing the heavy, gray uniform of Atlas security personnel. They weren't dead. Not exactly, they were fused into the walls of the pit, their faces frozen in expressions of silent, utter agony, their skin taut and translucent. Their bodies looked less like flesh and more like statues made of solidified, milky glass, and from the center of the largest, glass-fused guard, a man who looked chillingly like Lenny, a single, thin, blue filament, identical to the skin of the creatures outside, pulsed and stretched upward, directly connecting him to the rotating, geometric light source. That he wasn't dead. He was being used. My breath hitched. My detective's mind was failing, replaced by pure, visceral horror. This wasn't a crime, it was an extraction. A loud, splintering sound came from the service door. The creature was getting through. I had seconds. I raised my flashlight, aiming it at the swirling anomaly, and took my second, desperate photograph. Then I heard a new sound, one that drowned out the thrumming, a wet, squelching sound coming from the shadowed upper catwalks of the atrium. I looked up. A silhouette detached itself from the gloom. It was larger than the two creatures outside. Taller. Broader. And it didn't glide. It dropped. A massive, bone-white claw, ending in a razor-sharp, blue-tipped barb, slammed into the concrete floor 10 feet from me, throwing up a shower of dust and debris. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted deeper into the facility, the heavy thump-thump-thump of the enormous creature's pursuit echoing through the concrete bunker. I was trapped. The massive, bone-white claw retracted with a sound like tearing leather, leaving deep gouges in the concrete. I didn't get a good look at the creature, only its immense size and the predatory, intelligent fury in its movement. It was the creature's alpha, the one directing the hunt. My flight was purely instinctual. I scrambled past the fused security guards in the pit, ignoring the silent scream in their glassified faces, and plunged down the nearest stairwell, a narrow passage labeled Sublevel Archive and Primary Containment Access. The stairs were cold, echoing my frantic footsteps. The thrumming of the anomaly above lessened, replaced by the hollow silence of deep underground. I kept my flashlight off, trusting the faint, low-mounted red emergency lights, which seemed to illuminate only enough to showcase the absolute darkness beyond. I hit the bottom of the stairwell and found myself in a wide, hermetically sealed pressure door, the kind used for nuclear bunkers. Its locking wheel was massive and stiff. Engraved above it was the Atlas Company motto, rendered horribly ironic by the current situation, Lucite Lux Vestra, let your light shine. The heavy thumping from the atrium above was right at the top of the stairwell. The alpha was coming. I wrestled with the wheel, my gloves slipping on the cold metal. My fingers screamed in protest. Finally, with a grinding, metallic shriek, the door hissed open 6 inches. I dove through the gap, slamming my shoulder against the far side of the steel. I reached back and shoved the door with all my weight. The creature must have been halfway down the stairs, because the door suddenly vibrated with the force of an oncoming train, then a deep, tearing groan as the alpha creature hit the metal on the outside. It was buying time, not safety. I shone my flashlight around the new area. I was in a long, dusty corridor lined with banks of sealed, government-issue filing cabinets. This was the archive. The air here was drier, cleaner, but permeated by the smell of aged paper and something sharply chemical, like formalin. I started pulling drawers open at random, my fingers fumbling with the files, looking for anything that might explain the anomaly, the geometric hypercube, or the blue creatures. I was no longer interested in Lenny Kresnik's case. I was seeking a way to save my own sanity. The files were dense, numbered, and frustratingly technical. Project summaries, biosignatures, material decomposition reports. Nothing that screamed cosmic horror. Then I found it. Drawer 47. Folder marked PROJECT HELIOS. The file was thin, bound with a plastic clip. The title page was stark: Project Helios, Atlas Research, Top Secret, Tier 4 Clearance, Goal, Controlled, Localized Reality Displacement for Instantaneous Matter Transport, Methodology, the Stabilization of Non-Euclidean Geometry derived from the Bruise-Blue Signature, BBS, found in deep Antarctic ice cores. Source, Project Deep Chill. Primary Investigator, P.I. Dr. Adrian Vancroft. Current status, 6 days prior to closure. Catastrophic failure. Containment breach. P.I. Vancroft missing. That I flipped through the pages rapidly, the blood draining from my face. This was it. Not an oil spill. Not hazardous waste. 1 page, an internal memo, contained a chilling handwritten note scribbled in the margin: we didn't open a wormhole. We opened a vein. It's not the physics that's wrong, Marcus. It's the metaphysics. The BBS isn't a signature, it's a stain. And the shapes that come through, they're not biological. They're constructs. Sentient algorithms trying to stabilize in our reality. They need raw, dense energy. And the most readily available source is the conscious mind. A.V. P.I. Vancroft, the conscious mind. That explained the glassified guards, fused to the containment field below the anomaly. They weren't killed by a chemical reaction. Their essence, their very thoughts and sanity, had been extracted and fed into the rotating blue geometry. They were batteries. And Lenny Kresnik was the first sample. A sudden, sharp clang from the pressure door jolted me. The alpha creature was testing the cable, its strength immense. The steel was bowing inward. That I had to find Vancroft. If he was still alive, he was the only chance I had to understand how to close this vein. I found a layout map for the sublevel taped to the back of a cabinet door. The archive connected to 2 other sections, sublevel maintenance, and a heavily reinforced zone labeled PI quarters/secondary access. I grabbed the Helios file and sprinted towards the secondary access door, a smaller, less reinforced security door at the far end of the archive. As I ran, I heard a sound that chilled me more than the thumping or the hissing, a low, rhythmic sniffing sound, coming from the ceiling vents directly above me. I looked up, flashing my light for a split second. The metal grate was partially peeled back, and a thin, blue appendage, a delicate filament ending in a trio of obsidian black sensor nodes, was dangling down, weaving through the dust-filled air, searching. The creatures weren't just outside, they were already inside the structure, using the ventilation systems. I reached the secondary access door, my breath ragged. I fumbled for my lock-picking tools, adrenaline making my hands shake. Sniff. 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 The sound was directly over my head now. The small, secondary door lock clicked open. I burst through, slamming the light steel shut and throwing the deadbolt. I was in a small, windowless chamber. A desk, a cot, a half-eaten tray of food, and a wall of monitors. This was Dr. Vancroft's quarters, but Vancroft wasn't there. Instead, scrawled across the monitors, painted in thick, congealed blood, were 2 words, repeated over and over until the monitors were just a smear of crimson and black. It's me. I turned, my gun drawn, expecting the alpha to be through the door, but the real horror was on the desk. Dr. Vancroft had left a final message. Not on paper, but on a miniature, custom-made recorder. Next to the recorder, carefully placed, was a clear, water-filled jar. Inside the jar, floating peacefully, was a single, obsidian black sensor node, the same kind I'd seen dangling from the vent. It was identical to the tiny, dense note at the tip of the blue creature's appendages. I pressed play on the recorder. The voice was Vancroft's, calm, academic, and utterly broken. Sound of lab equipment humming, muffled by the anomaly's low thrumming. Log entry, Project Helios, Day 74. Containment failure is complete. The constructs, they are not from space, Detective Thorne. They are from before space. They don't want our matter. They want our structure. And they are adapting to our physics through biological assimilation. We thought we opened a gate, but we merely gave them a blueprint, a template for localized existence. A soft, wet pop sound. Vancroft sighs, a sound of resigned exhaustion. They learn fast. Too fast. I tried to seal myself away. But the smaller ones, they are composite. They can disassemble and pass through the smallest apertures. The filaments, they're seeking high-value consciousness. They are looking for the next PI. The one who understands how to close the vein. Vancroft's voice changes, becoming distant, almost dreamlike. I've detached the latest acquisition, a sensor node. It's beautiful, really. Pure, incomprehensible mathematics rendered in biological form. I've placed it in water. It detaches their network, momentarily. A momentary blind spot. The only protection, the only way to hide what I did next, a silence, then a heavy, sickening sound of a dull blade striking bone. I destroyed the PI. The mind that knew how to close it. I've destroyed the PI's primary cortex. The knowledge is gone. They won't find it here. I won't be another battery. They won't extract the closing code from my thoughts. The vein, it stays open, detective. But they will find the next mind that seeks to close it. And that mind will be you. The recording clicked off. I looked at the jar on the desk, at the detached, obsidian sensor node floating in. The water, the creature's eye and ear, and then at the blood-smeared wall, it's me. Vancroft had sacrificed his mind to deny the creatures the necessary knowledge. The door to the quarters, the one I had just bolted shut, began to rattle violently. The creatures outside were not wasting time. They knew I was the new PI, that I was the only one left with the knowledge of the anomaly, the vein, and the creature's motive. The horrifying cosmic truth of Sector 8 was now purely mine. The rattle of the door escalated into a sustained, heavy drumming. The alpha creature was trying to force entry, its immense weight and impossible strength threatening to tear the metal frame from the concrete wall. I was trapped in Dr. Vancroft's morbid sanctuary. I gripped my flashlight and sidearm, the cold weight of the metal offering minimal comfort against the impossible horror I now understood. The creatures weren't monsters, they were a systemic response to a reality leak, hunting the structure of consciousness to stabilize themselves. And now, they were hunting me, the new repository of the solution. I looked frantically around the small room. The only other exit was a low, bolted hatch in the floor beneath the cot, labeled Utility Shaft, Sublevel 2. A maintenance access point. My only chance, first, the sensor node. If Vancroft was right, the floating node in the water jar represented a momentary blind spot. It had been severed from the network, providing localized interference, perhaps cloaking the PI quarters from immediate detection until the physical assault began. I snatched the jar, tucking it securely into a deep internal pocket of my tactical vest. I would need its dampening effect later. I quickly checked the cot. Beneath the thin mattress was a small, military-style survival kit. Inside, a chemical flare, a spool of fine but strong monofilament wire, and a small, rusted iron hammer. Primitive, but potentially useful. I shoved the kit into my vest, then began dragging the heavy cot away from the wall, exposing the hatch. The steel door behind me began to emit a hideous, protracted screech as the alpha creature finally found a seam and began to peel the metal back like a sardine can lid. There was no time for finesse. I dropped the hammer onto the bolts, breaking the seal, and heaved the small steel door open, revealing a dark, claustrophobic shaft smelling heavily of ozone and electrical discharge that I plunged into the opening, dropping perhaps 12 feet into absolute blackness. I landed hard on a pile of dusty insulation and forgotten tools. The wind knocked out of me, the sound from above was instantaneous, a furious, deafening roar of non-language, followed by the sickening crunch of splintering metal as the Alpha tore through the PI quarters door that I scrambled to my feet, switching on my flashlight. I was in a crawlspace, a tangle of thick electrical conduits and ancient, sweating steam pipes. The heat here was stifling, a welcome contrast to the cold above, but the air was suffocating that I began to crawl, moving parallel to the foundation of the Atlas facility, following the general direction away from the central anomaly. The thrumming was muffled, but still present, resonating through the concrete floor inches beneath my belly. The crawlspace wasn't empty that I froze. My flashlight beam picked up the sickening blue sheen on the pipes ahead. A cluster of the smaller, spindly blue constructs were navigating the tight space, using their long, multi-jointed limbs to pull themselves along the cables. They were the ones Vancroft described, the composite, nimble hunters. They hadn't seen me yet, still moving slowly, methodically, their featureless heads sweeping from side to side. They were searching the network, seeking the location of the escaped consciousness. That I realized the horrifying implication of Vancroft's sacrifice. He didn't just deny them the closing code, he made me the only vessel of that essential knowledge, effectively marking me as the prize that I had to distract them. I had to create a new noise profile, a new point of focus, something massive enough to draw the Alpha creature's attention, and buy me a minute that I pulled the chemical flare from the survival kit. I also grabbed the spool of monofilament wire, unraveling a length and quickly wrapping it tightly around the small, heavy iron hammer. The plan was crude, desperate, and probably suicidal that I activated the flare. The intense, blinding white magnesium fire ignited with a fierce hiss. I shielded my eyes for a moment, then threw the burning flare as hard as I could down the long, empty conduit shaft, away from my escape path. The creatures ahead of me reacted instantly, their clicking accelerating into frantic static. They abandoned their methodical search and leaped towards the flare, drawn by the sudden, intense energy source, a new, volatile signal. The flare bought me a momentary chance. I crawled rapidly in the opposite direction, towards a rusted vertical service ladder marked with faded yellow paint. That I reached the ladder and began to climb, the oppressive heat and the smell of ozone making me lightheaded. As I ascended, I looked back. The blue figures were tearing at the flare, their limbs a blur of motion, attempting to extinguish the intense energy. Then, from the shaft I had just dropped from, the floor above me, I heard a sound of pure fury. The massive Alpha creature had located the utility shaft. That I reached the top of the ladder, kicking open a small, flimsy trapdoor. I was in sub-level maintenance, a chaotic room filled with broken air conditioning units, disconnected pumps, and stacks of old, oily machinery. That I had reached the surface level of the facility perimeter. I was just beneath the Sector 8 fence line. That my only chance now was to break back out. That I positioned the heavy hammer, wrapped in the monofilament wire, on top of a stack of metal shelving near the trapdoor. The shelving unit was precariously balanced. I didn't have time to rig a proper explosive. This had to be an improvised demolition. That I pulled out my sidearm. 3 shots. Targeted at the junction of the pipework and the wall. Bam. 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 The muzzle flash was blinding, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The heavy lead rounds tore through the brittle, ancient piping. A torrent of superheated steam and pressurized water erupted from the pipes with a violent, shattering hisses. The steam filled the room instantly, a dense, scalding fog, the trapdoor below me burst open. The alpha creature's colossal head and shoulders erupted through the opening, its featureless face obscured by the sudden, volcanic cloud of steam that it let out a distorted, furious bellow. The sudden steam and heat, a physical energy source, momentarily overwhelmed its ability to track me. It instinctively swiped at the nearest solid object, the rickety metal shelving unit. The blow was colossal, the shelving unit buckled, then collapsed, the wire-wrapped hammer flying off the top and striking a key structural element of the ventilation unit beside the trapdoor. The entire unit shuddered and crashed down, impacting the alpha's shoulder. The creature roared again, a sound of agony and immense frustration, temporarily pinned beneath the heavy machinery and blinded by the steam that I didn't wait to check. The fog gave me cover. I sprinted toward the nearest exterior wall, a thick, reinforced concrete panel. I saw a narrow conduit, a line for fiber optic cables, running through the wall, slightly larger than my fist. No time for the bolt cutters. I raised my foot and kicked repeatedly, aiming for the deteriorating concrete around the conduit. The wall cracked. I kicked one last time, driving my boot through the concrete and twisting the conduit until it snapped, creating a hole just large enough for my head. I shoved my head through the opening. The night air, cold and clean, hit my face like a tonic. I was outside. I was outside the Atlas facility, but I was still inside Sector 8. And the two smaller constructs were waiting for the Alpha signal, converging rapidly on the facility from the perimeter fence line. The hunt wasn't over. It had just moved to a much larger, darker playing field. I wriggled through the jagged hole, scraping skin and tearing my tactical gear, tumbling onto the cold, damp ground outside the Atlas facility. The air was still thick with the metallic tang and the faint smell of ozone, but the immediate threat of the steam-blinded Alpha was behind me. I rolled quickly onto my belly, pressing myself into the shadow of the concrete wall. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against the internal thrumming of the anomaly, which still pulsed from deep within the Atlas structure. The two smaller blue constructs, the nimble, scouting models, were now focused solely on my location. They glided with alarming speed across the asphalt, their clicking becoming a constant, tight rhythm. They were converging on the Atlas exterior, confident that the Alpha would deliver the prey. I didn't try to engage. My current objective wasn't to fight, it was to escape Sector 8, or at least reach a position where I could establish communication with the outside world. My flashlight beam cut a sharp line across the layout map from the Helios file. The logo's transit hub, Lenny Kresnik's original post, was the highest point in Sector 8, boasting a massive central tower designed for automated crane control and inventory management. It might offer two things I desperately needed: altitude to bypass the signal suppression, and a fortified position. It was nearly 2 miles away, through a maze of massive, echoing steel warehouses and long, exposed stretches of loading docks. I jammed the flashlight into my belt, drew my sidearm, and began to run. The open expanse of Sector 8 was terrifying. It wasn't just dark, it was geometrically confusing. The identical, towering warehouses created long canyons of shadow where sound warped and died. Every footstep felt deafening, swallowed almost instantly by the unnatural silence. The two small constructs were hunting me with brutal efficiency, using the geometry of the buildings. I heard the clicking echoes ahead of me, then behind me, then to my right, signaling they were flanking my position, anticipating my path. I dodged into a narrow alleyway between warehouses 4 and 5, scattering a flock of terrified, colorless rats. The space was choked with industrial debris and abandoned pallets. I moved in a low crouch, relying on the shadows. As I rounded the corner, I saw the first of the creatures, less than 30 feet away, emerging from a shadow. It was taller and thinner than I first thought, its structure a delicate cage of blue filaments. It stopped, tilting its head. The clicking ceased. The resonant hiss began, focused, deliberate that I raised my weapon and fired 3 rounds into the creature's center mass. Blam. Blam. Blam, the muzzle flash momentarily lit the alleyway in stark white and shadow. The creature didn't bleed. It didn't recoil. The hollow point round simply struck its filamentous body with a sound like throwing pebbles at a stretched canvas. The bullets passed through its form, punching clean holes in the material, and then impacted the concrete wall behind it with a spray of sparks. The creature staggered slightly, the hole in its lattice structure momentarily visible, pulsing with a darker blue. Then, with horrifying speed, the filaments stitched the damage closed. The creature let out a dry, resonant shriek of triumph. It had confirmed my position that my weapon was useless against them. They were constructs of energy, not flesh. I turned and sprinted, abandoning the element of stealth. I rounded the next corner and saw the Logos Transit Hub Tower in the distance, a concrete monolith piercing the night sky, its top shrouded in low fog. Hoped that I saw the second creature gliding in the opposite direction, attempting to cut me off before I reached the main logistics lane. I pulled out the jar containing the detached obsidian sensor node, Vancroft's Gambit. The local dampener. I didn't throw the entire jar. The water was the key to decoupling the network. I smashed the jar violently against the concrete wall. The water splashed outward, evaporating instantly on the cold ground. The obsidian node rolled across the asphalt and settled directly at the creature's feet. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The creature didn't disappear, but its movement stalled. The precise, rhythmic clicking dissolved into frantic, high-frequency static, a sound of confusion and disorientation. It began to thrash, its limbs whipping uselessly, unable to sense the network or its prey. The localized decoupling had blinded it. I bypassed the thrashing creature, taking the main access lane straight toward Logos. I ran harder than I had run in 20 years, knowing that the paralysis was temporary, and the Alpha would soon be free of the steam and on the hunt. As I ran past the massive, silent loading docks of the Logos hub, I saw the exact spot where Lenny Kresnik's body cam had been found. It was a circular patch of vitrified, blackened asphalt, shimmering faintly in the moonlight, but now, it was different. A faint, sickly green mold, the same pale, chemical-smelling mold I'd seen in the drainage culvert, was growing aggressively from the center of the vitrified circle, spreading outward. I reached the main entrance of the Logos Tower. The security booth was empty, the door ajar. Inside, the wall was smeared with a dark, dried substance, blood, but mixed with the same strange, viscous blue material. I found the main access panel. Fortunately, Logos relied on heavy, localized power generators, not the main city grid that Atlas had severed. The panel was still active. I slammed the emergency lockdown button. Heavy, reinforced steel shutters began to clang down over every loading bay door, echoing massively across the silent zone. The Logos Tower became a fortress. The Alpha would have to contend with steel and concrete, not flimsy walls. I didn't waste time going up the main elevator, it was too predictable. I found the maintenance stairwell and began the long, winding ascent to the control room, 20 stories above the ground. As I climbed, the city of Sector 8 transformed below me, shrouded in the low, cold fog, its massive, dark buildings looming like silent titans. Then, from the direction of the Atlas facility, miles away, I heard it. A sound that pierced the steel and concrete of the Logos Tower. A deep, territorial bellow, unlike the shrieks or the hissing. The Alpha was freed. I reached the 15th floor and paused for breath. The Logos Tower was a maze of machinery, cables, and catwalks. I looked out a narrow window. The Alpha creature was now visible, a hulking, six-legged horror, its composite body radiating the cold, bruise-blue light. It was moving with tremendous speed, shattering the asphalt beneath its weight. It wasn't heading toward Logos. It was heading to the perimeter fence. The Alpha wasn't pursuing me directly anymore. It was moving to seal the exit. It was completing the quarantine. I had only minutes before my only way out was secured by the main construct that I climbed faster, reaching the 20th floor and bursting into the glass-walled control room. I rushed to the central communication console, slamming my access card into the reader. The screen flickered to life. Come on, I muttered, fighting with the dense security protocols. I needed an external line, a coded frequency, anything to breach the localized suppression field. The screen flashed red, communication offline. Sector 8 wide signal suppression active. I looked up at the main monitor bank. The surveillance feed was static, except for one screen. A low-angle camera positioned on the far side of the Logos facility. The screen showed the massive alpha creature stopping at the perimeter fence. It didn't climb over. It didn't tear it down. Instead, the creature bent over and began to use its massive, sharp talons to methodically dig a wide trench beneath the fence, exposing the raw, cold earth, and then, from the trench, the pale, sickly green mold began to bloom, spreading rapidly from the vitrified asphalt of Lenny's last known location, growing outward beneath the fence line, spreading the infection. The alpha wasn't just sealing the exit. It was using the mold to anchor the anomaly's presence to our reality, turning Sector 8 into a permanent beachhead that I had to stop it. And the only tool I had left was the knowledge Vancroft had sacrificed his mind to give me. I stared at the surveillance screen in the Logos control room, the sickly green mold spreading beneath the perimeter fence like a malignant vein, guided by the immense, silent alpha creature. The true purpose of the Sector 8 closure became terrifyingly clear, not containment, but incubation. The constructs were terraforming the site, anchoring their reality leak to our world using the bioreactive mold as a catalyst. The communication console remained dark, the signal suppression absolute. I was perched 20 stories high, surrounded by glass, a beacon in the darkness, and the alpha had just finished sealing my exit. That I spun away from the console, turning toward the massive, multi-pane glass wall of the control room. I needed to act on Vancroft's final, desperate message. The constructs needed my consciousness, the closing code, to stabilize their own existence. If I could overload that exchange, perhaps I could reverse it. That I needed to lure the alpha back to the anomaly, or bring the anomaly to the alpha. I raced to the central control desk, flipping up panel after panel. The Logos Transit Hub was primarily an automated logistics center, managed by a complex mainframe designed to calculate the most efficient stacking and transport geometry for millions of containers. Geometry. Vancroft's file mentioned the non-Euclidean geometry of the anomaly. I found the manual override for the logistics mainframe. The system was complex, designed for precision mathematics. My mind raced, synthesizing Vancroft's notes. The Bruise-Blue Signature, BBS, was a stain, a blueprint for localized existence. The constructs were sentient algorithms seeking structure, the logical geometry of the human mind. I didn't have the closing code Vancroft had destroyed. But I had the Logos mainframe. I started programming furiously. I bypassed the standard logistics algorithms and began feeding the system a torrent of corrupted, paradoxical data, recursive loops, illogical geometries, self-contradictory logical statements. I wasn't programming a closure, I was programming chaos. I was attempting to create an anti-geometry, an ontological paradox designed to overload the construct's fundamental need for structure. The mainframe hummed to life, the cooling fans kicking in with a deafening roar. The main screen flashed violently, displaying complex, impossible shapes, tesseracts dissolving into spirals, infinite planes folding onto themselves. The thrumming that permeated the tower suddenly intensified, shifting pitch until it sounded like a colossal, grinding feedback loop. I looked out the window. The alpha, still digging at the fence line miles away, abruptly ceased its work. Its head snapped up toward the Logos tower. The creature was sensing the change. The mainframe's chaotic signal was broadcasting a powerful, corrupting presence that I had just declared myself a new, dangerously unstable source of structure. The Alpha let out another guttural roar and began its relentless, heavy-footed run toward the logo's hub, but I wasn't done. I needed to draw it closer. I had to make the ultimate broadcast that I found the switch for the logo's stadium lighting array. This array was designed to illuminate the entire 2 square miles of Sector 8 for 24-hour operation, capable of blinding brightness. It was powered by its own massive backup generator. I flipped the switch. Nothing happened. I hammered the panel. The power consumption of the mainframe was spiking, but the lights were dead. Wait. The lights weren't dead. I looked at the dark windows again, and then at the main breaker board. The power was flowing, but the light wasn't visible to my eyes. I pulled out the photograph I took earlier, the initial, grainy image of the pulsing blue anomaly near Atlas. I compared the color to the Alpha now running toward me. The constructs and the anomaly absorbed our visible light. They didn't just exist in the dark, they created it. They were actively filtering out the visible spectrum. I needed light they could see. I rushed back to the communications console. Though the system was suppressed for external broadcasts, the internal communications network was still active. I found the controls for the logo's automated crane system. The logo's hub used 4 massive, remote-controlled cranes for stacking containers, their control mechanisms relying on high-frequency infrared, IR, and ultraviolet, UV, optical tracking systems, wavelengths outside the visible spectrum. I activated the system. The giant cranes, dormant for days, shuddered and began to move, their massive arms extending over the logistics yard. I aimed the crane's optical systems, their powerful, unseen IR/UV lamps, directly at the logo's tower, where I was standing. I overloaded the crane lights, boosting the power input until the glass wall of the control room began to warm dangerously. To my eyes, the control room was still shrouded in shadow. But to the constructs, I had just ignited a colossal beacon. The mainframe shrieked, now spitting smoke. The entire tower was humming violently. The Alpha creature, less than half a mile away, suddenly accelerated. It knew where I was. It was sprinting, its massive legs blurring in motion, drawn by the twin signals, the mathematical chaos of the mainframe, and the overpowering flood of UV/IR radiation. I had mere seconds. I ran to the center of the control room, positioning myself directly between the sparking mainframe and the giant glass wall, the final element, Vancroft's jar. The detached sensor node. The localized dampener, the Alpha, was now directly below the tower, scaling the concrete structure with impossible speed, using its talons like ice picks. The drumming of its ascent shook the entire floor. I yanked the jar from my vest pocket. The water was gone, but the obsidian node remained, now resting on a cushion of damp cloth. The moment I removed it from the water, the thrumming sound in the room reached a fever pitch, attempting to re-establish the network connection. I held the node in my hand, feeling the alien cold radiating from its surface. I could feel the construct's immense, focused attention pouring into the room, anticipating the acquisition of the final, intact consciousness. The Alpha burst through the ceiling of the floor directly below, sending concrete dust and shrapnel flying. It was coming through the floor. I took a deep breath, clutching the obsidian node. I looked out the window, past the intense, invisible light of the crane system, into the dark, silent world of Sector 8. "I don't have the closing code, you alien mathematical horror," I whispered, my voice thick with exhaustion and terror. "But I can give you the anti-code." I hurled the obsidian node with all my remaining strength. I didn't throw it at the Alpha. I threw it directly into the sparking, collapsing logistics mainframe. The instant the alien material impacted the central processor, the logo's tower unleashed a shockwave. It wasn't a visible explosion. It was a wave of pure, geometric paradox. The mainframe's chaotic code and the anomaly's materialized fragment collided. the entire Logos Tower was instantly bathed in a blinding, agonizing flash of pure, raw white light, a spectrum of energy that must have encompassed every wavelength, from gamma to radio. The light was so fierce it felt less like illumination and more like a physical blow. Then, the floor below me went silent. The drumming stopped. The thrumming ceased. The light vanished, silenced that I was deafened, blind spots blooming in my vision. The smell of burnt circuits and ozone was overpowering. I collapsed to the floor, the alpha construct was gone. The mainframe was a slag heap of melted circuits. The glass walls of the control room were fractured but intact that I dragged myself to the shattered window. The massive logistics yard outside was now dark, the invisible IR/UV lights gone, but in the distance, over the Atlas facility, the Bruise-Blue geometric anomaly was no longer pulsing. It was shrinking. It was collapsing inward, the light fading rapidly, shrinking into a single, pinpoint of ultimate darkness. The vein was closing that I had won. But the victory felt hollow and terrifying. That moment of relief was shattered by a sharp, searing pain in my temple, followed by a voice. Not through my ears, but directly inside my mind. That it was Dr. Vancroft's voice, clear and academic, yet echoing with 1,000 alien resonances. Detective Thorne. Thank you. The logic bomb was successful. You destroyed the template. But you are now the last intact node. The closing process is incomplete. Find the mold. Destroy the anchor. Or the vein will simply reopen. The voice faded, leaving me alone in the silent, ruined tower, my head throbbing with a knowledge that wasn't mine. The creatures were gone, but the true threat remained, the infectious, sickly green mold spreading across Sector 8. The war was just beginning. The intrusive voice of Dr. Vancroft, or what remained of his consciousness, now echoing across the collapsed alien network, vanished, leaving me with a throbbing headache and the chilling reality: I had only initiated the closure. The creatures, the geometric constructs, were in retreat, but the vein, the tear in reality, was not sealed. The infectious green mold was the anchor, and if it wasn't destroyed, the anomaly would simply resume its catastrophic emergence. That I stumbled out of the ruined control room, ignoring the sharp glass shards and melted metal. The Logos Tower was a smoking tomb, but the silence outside was no longer the oppressive, unnatural void of the hunt. It was the silence of a catastrophic power failure, a relief that meant the localized signal suppression was finally lifting. That I checked my burner phone. 1 bar. Flickering. Enough. That I raced down the maintenance stairwell, running on pure adrenaline and the cold, terrifying certainty that I was now the target of a desperate, retreating force, as well as the sole carrier of the solution. When I reached the ground floor, I noticed the first significant change: the pervasive, unnatural cold was gone. The air felt normal, if still heavily scented with ozone and burnt chemicals. My senses were returning, but the memory of the psychic intrusion was sickeningly fresh. That I located the Logos generator room, a thick, reinforced bunker at the back of the facility. I needed power for external communication and, crucially, to destroy the bioanchor. That I bypassed the emergency backup systems, which were clearly fried. I aimed for the massive, diesel-powered primary generation unit. I pulled a heavy-duty wrench from a nearby toolkit and began working on the massive circuit breaker panel. I needed a localized, immense electrical surge. As I worked, the flickering bar on my phone stabilized. I had to alert Captain Davies, even if he was part of the cover-up. The situation was beyond internal jurisdiction. That I punched in the precinct number, bypassing the non-essential prompts. Davies, the captain's voice rasped, sounding impossibly distant and mundane. Captain, it's Thorne. I'm in Sector 8. The closure is not a spill. It's a dimensional breach. We need tactical support and heavy ordnance, specifically high-voltage demolition charges. There was a long silence on the other end, punctuated by Davy's heavy breathing. "Thorn, you're off the grid. You are to report back immediately. Environmental hazard teams are moving in at 0500 hours. This is not a request, Detective. Get out now." "No, Captain, you don't understand. The anomaly is closing, but its anchor is a bioinfestation. A green mold. It's spreading fast near the perimeter fence. If it takes hold, we lose the entire city. I need time. I need to burn it out." Davy's voice dropped, rough with fear and certainty. "Thorn, the mold is not a mold. It's a bioreactive containment gel developed by Atlas. The purpose is to consume the residual energy and seal the fracture. It's supposed to be there. Do not interfere with the green anchor." He disconnected. I stood there, the receiver pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. A bioreactive containment gel. Not an alien infection, but a countermeasure. A measure created by the same mad scientist, Vancroft, who had just used me to initiate the closing code, but Vancroft had sacrificed his mind to deny the creatures the closing code. Why would he want me to destroy a containment system? I looked at the mainframe printouts from Vancroft's archive, now crumpled in my hand. The BBS isn't a signature, it's a stain. The Alpha had been actively cultivating the mold, digging trenches to expose the Earth to it, speeding its spread. The constructs weren't destroying the containment gel, they were feeding it. They were weaponizing the cure. The gel, or mold, was meant to seal the fracture by consuming the anomalous energy. But if the energy was pure, non-Euclidean chaos, what if the mold itself was merely a faster, more effective vector for the infection, a way to stabilize the alien geometry in the biological substrate of our reality? I didn't trust Davies, and I certainly didn't trust the dying echo of Dr. Vancroft. I trusted my eyes. The Alpha was cultivating it. It had to be destroyed. I finished wiring the massive circuit breaker to bypass the safety controls, creating a direct path between the main power cell and the exposed external ground wire, a conduit for a massive, localized electrical discharge that I had to get to the mold. The perimeter anchor was less than a mile away, near Lenny Kresnik's vitrified spot. I raced out of the generator room, the roar of the diesel engine now deafening behind me, powering the grid for the final surge. As I exited the Logos hub, I stopped. The area was quiet, but I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the deep shadow of an overhang, motionless. It wasn't one of the blue constructs. It was human. Wearing the dark gray uniform of Atlas Security. It was Lenny Kresnik, but he was different. His skin was translucent, covered in patches of that sickly, pale green mold, which pulsed faintly in the gloom. His eyes were wide, milky white, and fixed on me with chilling intensity. He wasn't fused to a wall. He was mobile. He was the first host. "Don't," Lenny rasped, his voice a dry, thin echo, cracking like glass. "Don't touch the light." The light was the mold. The containment gel. The mold wasn't just a physical catalyst. It was a network. A new form of the construct's control. They had failed to extract the knowledge from Lenny's mind, but they had infected his body with the anchor, turning him into a defense mechanism. Lenny raised his hands. They were covered completely in the pulsing green mold. He moved with the same unsettling, deliberate speed of the constructs. "You're not going to destroy the structure," he whispered, 1,000 alien voices layered beneath his own. "You are going to complete it." He lunged at me. His goal wasn't to kill me, it was to touch me, to infect me with the bio-anchor, turning me into the next host for the knowledge I carried. I reacted instantly. I didn't fire my weapon. I pulled the chemical flare from my vest. Fire. Heat. Volatility. That I ignited the flare and shoved the intensely burning magnesium rod directly into the center of Lenny's chest. That he didn't scream. He didn't even recoil. The mold on his uniform and skin began to hiss and bubble violently under the chemical fire. The stench was immediate and unbearable. Burnt flesh and caustic chemicals. Lenny simply stood there, absorbing the searing heat, his milky eyes locked on mine, his mold-covered lips stretching into a silent, terrible grin. "You can't burn the truth, detective," the composite voice hissed. "The anchor is already set." I turned and ran, leaving the burning silhouette of Lenny Kresnik behind me. I had seconds before the heat overloaded his system, and I didn't want to be there when he exploded. That I sprinted toward the perimeter fence, toward the green, glowing anchor point. The final objective. I had to connect the logo's generator, the surge of pure, raw electrical chaos, to the anchor before the mold spread and stabilized the vein forever. I ran flat out towards the perimeter fence, the silhouette of Lenny Kresnik, the first host, burning fiercely behind me. The mold on his body was reacting violently to the intense chemical heat, the sight and smell a gruesome testament to the danger of the bioanchor. I didn't look back. I knew the chemical fire was a temporary stall, not a solution. The logo's generator roared behind the main hub, its deep diesel shudder vibrating through the ground, a promise of raw, chaotic electrical energy. I had set the stage for the overload, but I had to connect the fuse. I reached the scarred perimeter, the ground here still slightly warm from the alpha creature's recent digging. The chain-link fence was dark, but the ground beneath was sickeningly illuminated by the sickly, low glow of the green mold. It wasn't just a patch. It was a vast, sprawling organism, radiating outward from Lenny Kresnik's vitrified spot, spreading across the earth beneath the fence line in intricate, vein-like patterns. The mold was dense, pulsating, and covered with a strange, sugary sheen. The air above it was shimmering slightly, proof that the vein was still weakly connected. The anchor was massive. I carried two things: the heavy-duty ground wire I had stripped from the logo's generator output, and a military-grade entrenching tool from my gear bag. The wire was thick, coiled, and immensely heavy, cumbersome to carry. I dropped to my knees beside the mold, ignoring the sticky, unpleasant feeling of the contaminated soil. I had to expose the main network of the mold, its core. I began to dig with the entrenching tool. The top layer was dirt and asphalt fragments, but quickly, I hit a deep, interwoven layer of the mold. It was rigid yet spongy, its structure complex and surprisingly deep. It wasn't surface level. It was burrowing, connecting to the bedrock, rooting the anomaly into our physical world. As I worked, I heard a sound from the Atlas side of the fence, a low, rhythmic scraping. The two smaller blue constructs were returning. The collapse of the logo's mainframe and the temporary overload had scattered them, but they were now reforming, drawn back to the single, remaining source of structure, the green anchor, and the man trying to destroy it. I dug faster, sweat mingling with the cold, damp air. I had to reach a depth where the primary energy transfer was happening, the true point of infection. Scrape. 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 They were yards away, climbing over the heaps of excavated dirt left by the alpha. I broke through the final layer. The depth was about 3 feet. The mold here was different. It was a shimmering, viscous green liquid, bubbling slowly, connected to what looked like a subterranean pipe network. This was the source, the core energy sink. I snatched the thick, copper ground wire. I stripped the insulation back with my knife, exposing a wide braid of raw copper. The two blue constructs emerged from the shadows and froze, 30 feet away. They saw me, the wire, and the exposed anchor. Their clicking accelerated to a frantic, static-filled warning. They didn't charge. They stood motionless, using the last remnants of their structural ability to observe, waiting for me to make the final mistake. They were conserving energy, relying on the anchor to complete the job. I plunged the exposed copper wire deep into the bubbling green core of the mold. The moment the metal made contact, the mold reacted violently. The entire ground around me shuddered. The viscous liquid surged up the copper wire, covering my gloved hand in a thick, sticky film. A sound erupted, a sound of agonizing, composite pain, not from the creatures, but from the mold itself. It was a high-frequency, electronic scream of pure resistance, and then, Vancroft's voice was back, screaming inside my skull, raw and panicked. "Thorn. No. You're connecting it. That's a stabilization frequency. You're feeding the vein directly." I knew Vancroft was desperate, attempting to use the last vestiges of his fragmented consciousness to protect his own doomed research. I ignored the psychic onslaught, focusing only on the wire. I needed the other end of the wire connected to the logo's generator's exposed terminals. That meant running the cable for nearly a mile. Impossible. I looked at the fence. The chain-link perimeter fence, a massive structure of conductive steel, connected to the city's old electrical grid and, more importantly, running directly past the logo's generator. I twisted the copper wire, anchoring it firmly into the green core. Then, I snatched the small, rusted iron hammer, Vancroft's tool, from my pocket. I grabbed the copper wire and ran a short, taut length of it up to the chain-link fence. I slammed the hammer onto the wire, driving it through the copper mesh and welding the live terminal to the massive, steel perimeter fence. Zzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzzt. The noise was deafening. The entire chain-link fence, miles long, instantly glowed with an agonizing blue-white light as the full, unregulated power of the logo's generator surged through the steel. The electrical discharge was immediate and catastrophic. The raw, chaotic diesel power, intended to run cranes and lights, slammed into the core of the green anchor. The earth erupted. A blinding white-hot column of steam and energy shot up from the mold patch, boiling the sticky green liquid instantly. The smell was acrid, metallic, and overwhelming. The two blue constructs, still watching, were instantly caught in the arc. They didn't even shriek. They simply dissolved, their intricate filamentous structures unraveling and collapsing into ash under the sheer, brutal force of the electrical overload. The ground continued to shake. The fence continued to glow, its electrical roar deafening. I fell back, shielding my eyes, the heat and light searing. The anchor was burning. It was disintegrating. The energy surged and stabilized, then violently reversed. The massive discharge overloaded the logo's generator. With a tremendous, muffled roar, the diesel engine exploded within its bunker. Silence returned. A silence that was not alien, but rather the empty, ringing silence of complete systemic failure. I dragged myself up. The green mold was gone. In its place was a crater of smoking, blackened, vitrified earth. The fence was twisted and melted, the steel fused into grotesque shapes, and overhead, where the Bruise-Blue vein had been visible, there was only the dark, cold night sky. The anomaly, starved of its structural anchor and hit by the localized logic bomb, was gone. The vein was closed. I stood in the silence, listening only to my ragged breathing and the distant shriek of sirens finally approaching from the outside world. It was over. I had survived the night shift. I looked down at the copper wire fused to my glove. A single, dark fleck of the obsidian material, residue from the logo's mainframe overload, was embedded in the copper. A remnant. A souvenir. I heard the heavy screech of tires and the crackle of police radio. Captain Davies and the e-hazmat team were here. The first officer approached, his face grim. "Thorn, what the hell did you do here? The whole sector is dark. What was that explosion?" I looked at the smoking crater and the dead fence, then back toward the logo's hub, where the silhouette of the burning first host had finally collapsed into ash. "Hazard containment, officer," I said, my voice hoarse. High-level electrical surge. Just a little localized cleanup. The blinding, chaotic electrical surge had done its job. The ground where the green bioanchor had thrived was now a smoking, vitrified scar, and the entire Sector 8 perimeter fence was a useless tangle of fused, glowing metal. The silence that settled after the logo's generator explosion was heavy and final. That I stood over the crater as Captain Davies, his face pale and drawn beneath his helmet, approached with a squad of officers and hazmat personnel in bulky, sealed suits. "Thorne." "Report," Davies demanded, his voice thick with a mix of relief and barely contained rage. He didn't ask about the explosion. He wanted to know why his internal jurisdiction had been turned into a war zone. "Localized electrical fire and chemical containment breach, Captain," I said, my voice steady, reverting to police jargon. The chemical interaction with the old logo's generator short-circuited the main grid, causing the blast. "No casualties, minimal property damage to the structures. The area is secure." I deliberately omitted the two dissolved constructs, the Alpha, the Glassified security guards, Lenny Kresnik's fiery end, and the dimensional breach. I couldn't tell him the truth, he wouldn't believe it, and he'd have me institutionalized. Davies surveyed the scene, the blackened earth, the melted fence, the silent, dark warehouses. He saw a massive, expensive cleanup. He saw an internal mess that could easily be swept under the carpet with the right paperwork. "You're a liability, Thorne. But you're also the only one who can write the report without mentioning the real reason this sector was closed," Davies said, his eyes drilling into mine. He knew I was lying, but he accepted the narrative. The department couldn't afford a scandal of this magnitude. He pointed to a black, non-standard issue SUV parked discreetly outside the perimeter. "Awaiting transport. Debriefing is internal. You say nothing to hazmat. You deal with the paperwork directly with me." I nodded, acknowledging the cynical bargain. I was a loose end, but a necessary one. As the hazmat teams began their slow, methodical sweep, collecting samples of the vitrified earth and the fused metal, searching for the hazardous chemicals, I walked toward the exit point, past the twisted wreckage of the fence. Just before I stepped out of Sector 8, I stopped near the original drainage culvert where I had crawled in hours earlier. The sickly green mold was nowhere in sight. The ground was scorched, but the silence was normal. The fight was over, but then, I saw it, resting on a pile of debris, beside the remains of my discarded bolt cutters, was an object that hadn't been there when I entered. It was a small, smooth stone, the size of a pigeon's egg. It was completely black, obsidian dark, and utterly cold to the touch, and embedded within the stone, pulsing faintly with that residual, deep bruise-blue light, was a single, perfect geometric pattern, a miniature, stable representation of the hypercube I had seen in the Atlas facility. It was beautiful, impossible, and chilling. The creature's essence hadn't been destroyed by the overload. It had been refined, the surge had closed the vein, but the explosion had also condensed the residual non-Euclidean energy into a physical, contained form. The fight had simply changed the constructs from an invading force to a latent, sleeping threat. I picked up the stone. It felt heavy, cold, and strangely resonant in my hand, as if a quiet, continuous hum was emanating from its core. The thrumming I had heard on Lenny Kresnik's tape. Now, it was miniaturized. I immediately reached into my pocket and touched the small, dark fleck of obsidian residue that was fused to the copper wire, the remnant of Vancroft's gambit. The two materials felt connected, siblings born from the same catastrophic logic. This wasn't just a trophy. This was the leak. The physical manifestation of the closed vein. And it was now in my possession. I stepped over the threshold, finally leaving Sector 8. The normal noise of the approaching patrol cars and the distant city felt deafening after the hours of unnatural silence. I got into the black SUV. The driver, a young, anonymous man in a pressed black suit, didn't look at me. As the SUV pulled away, I glanced down at my hand, keeping it hidden below the window line. I closed my fingers tightly around the cold, dark stone. The creatures were gone. The anomaly was closed. The threat was neutralized, but the seed of the collapse, the potential for the vein to reopen, was now in my pocket. And I was the only one who knew what it was. The internal debriefing with Davies would be a painful exercise in omission and fabrication. The media would get the high-level toxic spill narrative. Sector 8 would eventually be cleaned, rebuilt, and forgotten, but Detective Marcus Thorne would never forget, because as the car drove further away, out of the suppressed zone, I heard it again. Not in my ears, but in the echoing chambers of my memory, the voice of Dr. Vancroft: find the mold. Destroy the anchor. Or the vein will simply reopen. I had destroyed the anchor. But now I held the condensed essence of the vein itself. The night shift was over. But the cover-up, the deeper, more terrifying surveillance of the cosmos, was just beginning. My name would be the only one on the official report, the only one who would carry the weight of this secret, and the silence of the black stone in my hand was the most terrifying sound of all. The forced debriefing with Captain Davies was a masterclass in bureaucratic fabrication. I signed forms confirming the extreme toxicity of the Sector 8 site, detailing the unforeseen catastrophic electrical overload that caused the destruction, and validating the narrative of a massive environmental hazard containment. Davies, his face set in a permanent scowl, never once mentioned the blue constructs, the anomaly, or the missing Atlas personnel. He was satisfied with the cover story, content to bury the terror under a mountain of paper and governmental red tape. I was given indefinite administrative leave, not as punishment, but as isolation. Davies knew I was unstable. He just needed me out of sight. I went home to my small, anonymous apartment, but the terror I carried wasn't in my mind, it was in my coat pocket. The obsidian artifact, the small, black stone containing the miniature, pulsing blue hypercube, never left my side. I kept it wrapped in a towel, inside a locked, lead-lined box in the darkest corner of my safe, but the isolation was a lie. The artifact was still communicating. It didn't speak with a voice, but with a feeling. An intrusive, cold logic that permeated the silence of my apartment. Whenever I tried to sleep, I felt the stone's inherent structural chaos, the incomprehensible geometry of the alien universe, pressing against the stable, Euclidean framework of my mind. I couldn't shake the sensation that the simple act of thinking near the stone was feeding it, providing the structural energy Vancroft had warned about. The closing code wasn't a formula, it was my consciousness. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening around the artifact, the geometry. My apartment, a place of stable right angles and predictable shadows, began to subtly shift. Doors that were closed would be slightly ajar. Picture frames hanging straight would tilt precisely 4.7 degrees. It was a constant, minor rearrangement, reflecting the chaotic logic inside the stone. The dreams. My sleep became a nightmare of pure mathematics. I would wake up sweating, heart hammering, having dreamt only of impossible geometric shapes that folded and unfolded in 4 dimensions, their angles the chilling, Venus blue of the anomaly, the interference. Every piece of digital technology near the safe, my laptop, my television, my digital clock, suffered intermittent, precise failures. The screens would glitch, briefly displaying perfect, crystalline patterns that mirrored the hypercube within the stone, before reverting to static. I realized the closing of the vein hadn't ended the threat, it had simply compressed it. The obsidian artifact was a latent structural seed, a miniaturized anomaly, quietly exerting its impossible geometry on my reality, testing the boundaries of my world. The ultimate horror. I had to keep it. Destroying it might release the energy in a catastrophic localized blast, reopening the vein right here in the middle of Olympus City. My only option was surveillance. I was the keeper of the gate, and the gate was in my pocket. One rainy afternoon, driven by the need to understand, I revisited Vancroft's final message, the psychic imprint I carried: find the mold. Destroy the anchor, or the vein will simply reopen. I had destroyed the anchor, the green mold. But I had created the artifact, the vein's crystallized core. Vancroft's warning meant the danger was still present, perhaps even greater. That I decided to check the Sector 8 files again, specifically the e-hazmat reports that Davies had suppressed. Using my old badge and a few carefully placed calls, I gained access to the restricted internal network. That I found the e-hazmat final assessment on the green bioreactive containment gel. The report was terse and heavily redacted, but one finding stood out: Biointegrity Report 74-D. Residual biological material recovered from the perimeter destruction site was highly resistant to electrical overload. Initial lab samples were destroyed by unknown localized interference. Final chemical analysis indicates the material is not a synthetic polymer, but an extremely complex mycelial network composed of organic silicon and trace elements of non-Euclidean geometry, (NEG). Crucially, the mycelium seems to possess a highly adaptive defense mechanism. Prior to the electrical surge, a sample detached from the core was found miles away, near the Sector 8 drainage culvert. The detachment seems to have been intentional, propagating a latent seed. The detached sample is currently dormant, requiring a specific energetic signature to reactivate. A latent seed, Lenny Kresnik's infected body, wasn't the only thing propagating the mold. Before the main anchor was destroyed, the organisms had seeded the periphery, scattering biological failsafes. The green mold wasn't merely a catalyst, it was the scouting network, waiting for the return of the energetic signature, and I knew exactly what that energetic signature was. It was the obsidian artifact in my pocket. That if the latent mold seed was reactivated by the artifact's presence, it would grow and connect to the artifact's non-Euclidean core, forming a new, unstoppable vein, a new gate, wherever the artifact was located. And it was located in my safe. My apartment wasn't a quarantine, it was a target. That I had to move the artifact, but more importantly, I had to find and destroy the latent seed of the green mold before it could be triggered. I remembered the location, the Sector 8 drainage culvert, where I had entered. The last place I'd seen the mold was in the water, on the ceiling of the tight passage. It was time for Detective Marcus Thorne, officially on leave, unofficially carrying the weight of the cosmos, to go back to work. I drove my unmarked car back to the derelict edges of Sector 8, navigating the muddy, overgrown service roads I had used weeks prior. The official barriers were gone, replaced by "no trespassing" signs and hastily erected chain link that screamed, ironically, temporary. The city was moving on, eager to pave over the catastrophe. I parked the car deep in the scrub brush, ensuring I had line of sight to the old freight rail spur. I was dressed in dark civilian gear, armed with my standard issue sidearm, and carrying a new element, a small, high-powered acetylene torch, heavy-duty gloves, and a sealed metal bucket. My mission: destroy the latent seed of the green mold without exposing it to the obsidian artifact, the stabilized fragment of the vein I carried. I approached the perimeter fence where I had crawled in weeks earlier. The fence was rebuilt, the ground no longer vitrified. It looked utterly normal. Too normal that I located the old drainage culvert, the narrow, concrete passage beneath the rail spur. The air here was damp and smelled of stagnant water and mildew. I secured the lead-lined box containing the obsidian artifact beneath the rail spur, 60 feet away from the culvert entrance. I had to create a critical distance. I dropped to my belly and crawled into the narrow, dark tunnel. The passage was tight, cold, and wet. I moved slowly, using my flashlight, looking for the sickly, pale green sheen of the latent mycelium. I found it just past the halfway mark, near the ceiling of the culvert. It was tiny, almost invisible, a patch of pale, translucent threads no larger than my palm, nestled amongst the damp, concrete cracks. It wasn't actively growing, but it was alive, a biological tripwire waiting for the energetic signature of the artifact that I pulled out the acetylene torch. The roar of the gas ignition was deafening in the confined space, the intense blue flame slicing through the darkness that I aimed the torch at the latent mold patch. The instant the heat hit the organism, it reacted. Not by burning, but by flaring. The mold glowed with a sudden, intense burst of sickly green light, and the thin threads began to thrash violently, sending out minute, dust-like spores, the high-pitched, electronic screaming, the sound of the alien logic network in pain, erupted inside my skull, instantly overriding my hearing. It was Vancroft's composite voice, raw with fury and despair, "No. Do not harm the network. You will become the sole host." I endured the psychic assault, holding the intense flame steady. The mold was highly resistant to the heat, designed to survive cataclysm, but I wasn't trying to burn it, I was trying to vaporize it, to utterly annihilate its structure before it could grow. That I held the flame on the patch until the concrete around it was scorching and smoking. The mold shriveled, the green light collapsing into tiny, black specks of carbonized ash. I continued burning the surrounding area for 30 seconds, ensuring the mycelial network was completely destroyed. That I emerged from the culvert, panting, the psychic scream echoing away into a painful ringing in my ears. The latent seed was gone, but the final problem remained, the obsidian artifact. The condensed seed of the vein itself. That I retrieved the lead-lined box. I now had the full, focused attention of the alien logic, no longer diffused by the mold network. That I drove back to my apartment, the cold, heavy stone burning a psychic hole in my pocket. I knew I couldn't keep it, and I couldn't destroy it on land. That I drove to the Olympus City shipping docks, a massive, chaotic port miles from the abandoned Sector 8. I bypassed security, using the distraction of the night shift loading operations. That I walked to the edge of the deepest berth, where the massive container ships docked. Below me was the black, frigid water of the deep Atlantic, the only place on Earth where the pressure and distance might mitigate the effects of the stone. That I opened the lead-lined box and pulled out the obsidian artifact. That it was impossibly cold. It pulsed slowly, faintly, with the bruise-blue light. It was silent, but I felt its enormous, patient presence, a structural singularity waiting to bloom. That I closed my eyes, took one final, steadying breath, and made the decision. Vancroft's core knowledge was lost, the mold was destroyed, and the vein was closed. I had to put the key where no one, not even myself, could ever retrieve it. That I hurled the obsidian artifact with all my strength. That it arced high into the air, a tiny, dark spark against the city lights, before plunging into the frigid, crushing depths of the Atlantic Ocean. The instant it hit the water, I felt a massive, silent shockwave, not physical, but purely mental. A terrifying sense of structural collapse, of pure non-existence, slammed into my consciousness. It was the sound of the final piece of the anomaly being buried under a mile of water and pressure. Then, the final, perfect silence. The ringing in my ears stopped. The psychic hum vanished. That I stood there for a long time, listening to the normal sounds of the port, the creak of cables, the horn of a distant ship, the cries of gulls. The world was stable again. That I walked away from the pier. The night shift was truly over. My career as a detective was likely finished. I had no evidence, only a fabricated report and a lingering awareness of things that shouldn't exist. That I looked down at my hand. The tiny, dark fleck of obsidian residue, the piece of the closing code, was still fused to the copper wire in my glove. A final, minute fragment. I scraped it off and let it fall onto the dock. It was inert. The main body was gone. That I knew the cover-up would hold. The fear of the impossible was far easier to handle than the mundane truth of official failure, but I also knew that I was the only person who had walked through the gate and returned with the knowledge. My purpose had changed. I was no longer a detective. I was the silent watcher, the keeper of the truth, and every time I looked at the dark sky, I saw not stars, but the places where the geometric nightmares waited. I knew the vein was closed, but the universe was vast, the night shift dossier was complete. For now, thank you for allowing me to craft this story for you. I'm glad I could provide a fresh, extended horror narrative based on your request.